Alright, here we are again. I just figured I'd run a little thing by you. This is one I did a while back in one of my classrooms, and I modified it a little bit. And hard start complaints was something I used to have to deal with a lot when I was working at the dealership, and I like to teach my students to deal with it because hard start can be caused by so many different things. There's a couple of little items in here that I may have covered before, but it doesn't really matter because we're all having a good time here, and I'm not charging you anything for these, So here we go. When I first started picking up wrenches, first thing I would check would be for spark and proper firing order. We yank the air cleaner, prop the choke open. We'd hold this choke open, and I'd like to move the the accelerator, to see if I would see the accelerator pump jets squirting fuel in there. The accelerator pump's really important, and vehicles need the same thing now. They always need an accelerator pump to change from idling to accelerate, because it takes a little bit for that gas to get in there, and you need more. So it also needs it for the start. Whenever you tap the gas on the old carburetors, the choke would shut, and then whenever you started it up, you wet the manifold tapping the gas. And when it started up, the choke would open about 1/8 of an inch, because the choke pull off had a vacuum brake on it. And then as the choke spring heated up, or whatever mechanism they had operating that, it would open that choke back up all the way. Usually within about 90 seconds, the choke would be completely straight up and down. If the choke opened too much, it would cause the engine to stall. Like sometimes the air going in would pull the choke open against the spring that wasn't quite as stiff as it used to be, and then the fast idle cam would catch it and it would cause it to stall. And then I would basically always drill those rivets out or whatever and put a little bit more tension on the choke spring, and then put screws back in there and all that. I could tell another story about that. We jerked the plugs out, see if they were wet and sooty or used up or something like that, So hard start diagnosis usually led down a different path because we're talking about newer vehicles. So this is no start versus hard start that I'm talking about here. And we'll fast forward a bit, mostly try to leave the carburetors and the oil-filled coils behind us. For years, contemporary wisdom in textbooks would tell you to let it jump 1/4 of an inch. If you looked at any of the older textbooks, they'd say let the spark jump 1/4 of an inch. But I have seen repeatedly where mechanics got led down the wrong trail by that, because they would say, well, it's got a 1/4 of an inch spark. There's one guy that had gone to technical college and somewhere and had come over there to work with me, wound up over at the city shop working over there. And he had a truck that came in there, an F-150 or something, that had an E-core ignition coil on it. And he had worked trying to figure out why that thing wouldn't start. And I said, well, did you check spark? He says, well, yeah. And he, let it jump 1/4 of an inch. And I says, well, that's not going to do it. What you're going to need to do is you need to stretch that spark. You need to let it scare you. I've talked about this on here before. It needs to be probably stretched to about 1 inch and just scare the living daylights out of you. Sound like lightning popping there. If you've got good strong spark, you can look somewhere else for your problem. You may have a spark timing issue, but if the spark is strong enough to jump that far and it's making it to the plugs at that strength, you should have enough spark to get it to start up. But anyway, long and short of it is, he put a coil on that one, straightened it right out. Okay, so my dad could actually look at that spark though, and it's real easy on those Volkswagen Bugs. My dad worked on a lot of time. He could, if somebody reversed the polarity on an oil-filled coil, it wouldn't work right, wouldn't run right. And so my dad could look at that spark and tell you if the polarity was reversed on that oil-filled coil by which way this little thing was pointing. It was a strange thing, but he told me that. That wasn't anything you'll see in a book anywhere. But a spark can jump in real easy in sea level air pressure better than it can in a compression. Now, one of the things that carries the spark in the cylinder is the molecules of gasoline that are in there. It jumps from one of those to the next. That's why at the end of your pattern, that little spark line has a tendency, not the firing line, but the spark line has a tendency to jump up at the end because it has used up all the fuel, and the little wiggle after the spark burns out is how much energy it had left that it could have used if there was more gas. That's another thing right there. So I remember one hard start in 88 Taurus that would fire up after spinning for about 30 seconds, and it had me confused until I connected the scope and found out the E-core ignition coil wasn't too weak to start it. It just, when I checked it also, just looking at it too, after I checked it with the scope, it would only jump a spark about 3/4 of an inch. If you stretched it more than that, the spark would go out. And I said, well, that's a problem right there. So I put a coil on that one and fixed it right up. It took me a little while to figure it out though, because I felt like I had the idea that if you had enough spark, if it was starting at all, a weak spark, I was thinking in that particular case would do it. Then I found out a weak spark can make it start hard, even if it runs normally. He didn't have any complaints at all about the way it ran, but it took it a while to get it started, you know. Anyway, so when testing for spark, make sure you stretch it far enough to determine it's not weak. That's rule number one on a single coil vehicle with a hard start concern. It's good to have an adjustable spark tester. You can also, even on the cop coils, if you've got a spark tester like this that you can adjust so you can watch the spark, you can actually adjust it out so that it takes about 60 or 70,000 volts to fire, and check every one of those coils one at a time, and you'll smoke out a bad coil like that if you want to take the time to do that when you find one that won't fire with the same intensity that all the other ones do. And it might be difficult for you to find that, but there's a lot of ways you can do that, different tools you can use. There was the Bronco that would start only with the spout connector disconnected. I ran into that and it beat me up for a while. I found that on the service bay diagnostic system. The ground, one of the grounds was really, really ugly on that. You pull the spark output connector, which was this thing here where you adjust the timing, it would start right up. Plug it back in, you know, wouldn't start for nothing. Because the ground traces would go crazy while the engine was spinning on that Bronco. Turned out to be a voltage drop problem at the battery to ground cable connection. It was spinning over this fine, but it was dropping enough voltage there that it was creating noise in the computer grounds. And that's an issue right there. Now there are burn through rotors and faulty ignition modules. I've seen burn through rotors like on the old HEI ignition. Some of you old timers might remember that whenever and on some of the Jaguars and stuff, when it burned through, it wouldn't start at all because the spark would be going straight through the rotor to ground. But if the rotor's got enough space there so that it's easier for it to go to the spark plugs than it is to go through the rotor to ground, you can have a situation like I ran into a few times where it would stumble when you would give it the gas, fall on its face. But then if you capped off some of the air going into the air inlet tube, it would rev up normally. And that'll make you think it's a fuel problem or something. You know, think about when you're putting a rag over the carburetor and it runs better. You say, oh, it's running lean, you know, it needs got a vacuum leak somewhere, the carburetor needs to be adjusted. Anyway, I'd cap off that thing part of the way with my hand and go, boom, 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 and take my hand off and go, boom, 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 like that. So I got to digging around on that and found rotors burnt through on some of them, like some of the Fords, you know, that had the gray rotor that was with the normal size distributor, not the big fat one like the HEI. There was enough space in there, and I'd seen that on a Mercury Tracer. That was that old, Japanese Mazda type. But anyway, the long and the short of it is, that's something that will throw you for a loop if you didn't know it. One time I had a Ford Probe, back at like a 90 or 91 model Ford Probe, that would drive until it got hot and then it would quit. And so I drove it around the traffic circle and got out there in front of a movie gallery and the thing quit, and I pulled over into the turnaround. And I sat there for a second and didn't have any spark. And I said, I bet that module's hot. I never had seen that on a probe before, you know. When you got working on something that doesn't break down a lot, and those old probes didn't break down all that much, you know. I took the windshield washer hose, loose from the windshield washer, and I propped it over there so it was over the ignition module. And washed the windshield a little bit and let it go across there and cool that module off. And it fired right up, and I took it right back to the shop. But anyway, that's the only time I ever ran into that on one of those probes. I've still got that module in my junk drawer in my toolbox somewhere. I just kind of kept it as a souvenir. Anyway, so with spark either verified or eliminated as a possible cause, the next thing we need to know about our no start is how much battery voltage is still available to the PCM with the starter doing its thing. If that battery voltage, particularly on a Ford, drops below 7.2 volts, it will not even operate the injectors on some of these vehicles. Now, I'm not going to say it's like that on every one of them, but Fords don't typically start if it goes below 7.5. If you've ever been familiar with some of your Power Stroke diesels, it'll tell you if the battery voltage goes below 7.5 when you're spinning it, that's not enough battery voltage and you need more juice. It'll seem to be spinning at a pretty good speed, but when you try to fire the injectors, and this is regular gasoline fuel injections like this too. And it'll, like I say, it'll throw you because it'll sound like it's spinning fast enough. And if you're checking the voltage in that battery while you're spinning it, If it goes below a certain level, it won't fire the injector. If the system voltage is sufficient, it's important to know whether or not the injectors are clicking. In other words, if I have good system voltage and I have good strong spark, next thing I like to switch it on and listen to see if I hear the fuel pump. If I hear the fuel pump, I know the PCM can turn on the fuel pump. If the fuel pump's running and I've got pressure, now here's the point. If you got a no start, you're always going to check fuel pressure after you check spark, because if you check it before you check spark, you may set the motor on fire. Anybody that's ever done that, if you worked on cars very long, you've set one on fire, whether you want to admit it or not. If you hadn't, you're not like me, because about once a year or something would happen, I'd have one set on fire. And that brings to mind a funny story. This guy that was working in the service bay facing mine pulled in there on a Bronco 2. And the guy there was a guy standing there and says, open the hood, because there was a little bit of smoke coming out from under the corner of the hood. And when he opened the hood, there was nothing but a big wall of flame that came out and almost singed his eyebrows, and he let go of it and dropped the hood again, because it was a hood that propped up. And he said, open the hood again. Anyway, ended up in a fire extinguisher and put it out. And of course, the thing about it is, if one catches on fire while you're working on it, even if you get it put out, you don't have to fix everything that happened under there, or that's the way it was in the shops where I've worked. And you don't get paid to do it, I went out there to the service lot one day to work on a Taurus, or to check it. And I did everything in the right order, but somehow or another there was a little gas down there that managed to catch fire on top of under the distributor, a little 3-liter. And that thing, poof, it caught fire, and I blew it out. It caught fire, and I blew it out. And I blew myself almost completely out of wind and started getting dizzy, but every time I blew it out, it would come right back, driving me up the wall. And I couldn't leave it and go get a fire extinguisher or nothing, and I was having to yell help with whatever wind I had left and all that. I finally blew it out so that it didn't come back, but that scared the daylights out of me. All right, so the data stream is not giving you real world information. You basically want to know what the pulse width in milliseconds. You can do it with a scope or an enhanced scan tool, but the PCM is giving you a window into itself with that scan tool, and sometimes it updates pretty slowly. You're really getting the information filtered through 2 computers on the way to your eyeballs. And it's better off if you can to go ahead and scope it. But I like to listen to the injectors and see if they're going click, 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 click. If they're clicking, see, if I've got spark and I got fuel injector click, I know the crank sensor is basically sending a signal to the engine controller. Knowing how it thinks helps a little bit. Now, let's think of that little fuel delivery. You know the little rubber bulb that you got to pump on those little Tecumseh motors? It wets that manifold. On carbureted engines, before an engine will start, there has to be a surplus of fuel in the intake, thus the accelerator pump and the follow-up of the closed choke. But on a fuel-injected engine, you need the same thing. Now, you might remember some of these things had got a cold start injector. Some of the older ones, they'd have an injector that was specially there just for the purpose of wetting the manifold when you first started, and it was the only time that injector did anything. They did away with that when they figured out we can set the algorithm so that it can double pulse the injectors or bank fire them, whichever it decides. Look at this 3-liter. I built this board here when I was teaching over there, and I want you to watch what this thing does. What you're going to see whenever I turn that key and start that thing, when this crank sensor wheel starts turning, you're going to see the LEDs that correspond with these injectors blinking at all the same time until it reaches at a certain speed. That's what it does with the injectors. And it's just about universal that all of these fuel injection systems work the same way, because they all need the same thing. All right, let's go ahead and let's back up here and see if I can click on that and get it started. All right, watch whenever it spins over. All right, you see them injectors? They're pulsing all at the same time, and then when it gets to a certain speed, they got to start doing something. That was the stuff I used for that was a 98 Explorer. All right, let's see that again. All right, one more time. We're going to turn the key, and we're going to start that crank sensor spinning, and it's blinking them all at once, and then it follows the firing order after that. See, it's really important that it does that too. Now, the way that it tells you to do that, fuel injection engines are no different than a carburetor. During cold start, they got to fire simultaneously or bank fire to provide enough fuel needed to light the engine on. Now, moving the throttle while you're spinning the engine might or might not put too much fuel in there, because it's paying attention to your throttle even when you're starting it. And it can actually add extra injector pulse sometimes. You might know that on a lot of the, and it's not like this on all of them, but on a lot of them, when you push the fuel accelerator pedal all the way to the floor, it turns off the injectors. All right, so that's for clear flood mode. But I mean, when you're moving it in between, it's looking at how fast you're moving it, and if you're moving it, if it comes off there. It's also, it's important not to touch the throttle if you don't have to when you're starting it, because it uses what it sees when you first turn on the key to determine what closed throttle is. And if you give it a bad number there, it'll have to fool around and update later and all that. It can cause it to go, when you're, if it's reading part throttle when it pulls up to a stop sign, particularly if you're in one that's a manual transmission, it'll cause it to idle high because it's still in dash pot mode. That's another story. All right, so on non-electronic throttle control vehicles, it's more important for the idle air control to be wide open during initial start. It needs to run out. These kind right here got a little stepper motor in them. The Ford one used amps to pull against the spring and all that. If the IAC doesn't provide the needed air because of the sticking, a bit of throttle opening sometimes will get it fired up. But if you can get it fired up but you let off and it dies, or on one of the Ford ones, if it sticks and then pops loose, it may make it start hard, and sometimes, not idle, stall. Wet spark plug can cause a hard start, because the spark runs on the wet instead of jumping across the gap. The spark's going to take the path of least resistance, and if the plug's wet, that's why a flooded spark plug won't fire, is because the spark is able to travel on all that wetness, so to speak. All right, and it can wash the cylinder walls down too in some of these low attention piston rings like these newer ones they got now. A throttle position sensor that's drifting into wide open throttle with no throttle movement can cause intermittent hard start or no start, because most fuel injection engines shut the injectors down at wide open throttle. You can try to demonstrate that, but you got to be careful, because if you got your throttle wide open and you start it up and tries to run away, you got to be able to pull your foot off there. But I mean, some of these even later models, if you hold the throttle all the way to the floor, it will actually kill the fuel injectors, thinking that you're trying to clear out a flooding situation. Shut off the injector, run air through there, dries the plugs off, And I've shown you about this one the other day on the Body Shop Dodge. An ECT or IAT sensor can develop an open circuit and cause hard no start issues. This right here is giving you 104 degrees because you remember that idle intake air temperature sensor was open. This was substituted by the enhanced OBD, and basically if you had 104 degrees Fahrenheit and 41 degrees coolant temperature, you would need lots of fuel. But this one here was lying, and so it was putting too much fuel in there and went in the plug. Fuel composition sensor on Flex Fuel vehicle reports more alcohol than the truth. The PCM might overfuel during starting and foul the plug. We saw that on a 2004 Tahoe, I think it was. And it would start hard, like that. And the one time we caught it, it didn't do it every time, but the time we caught it starting hard, it had wet the plug, and the plugs were new. And so I got to digging around in there, and I saw that the fuel composition sensor, which is actually this thing right here, it basically reads how much the alcohol content is in there, and it was reading 45% alcohol content. So I got a hold of the lady who owned the truck, and I says, what kind of fuel are you putting in there? Are you putting any flex fuel in there, or just regular gasoline, or whatever? She said, we don't ever use that flex fuel junk. We just use straight gasoline. I've never used any of that. And I said, well, that's going to be what's wrong with it anyway. So the problem was that doggone thing cost over $700 to be buying from the GM dealer. Anyway, the long and short of it is, it took that right there, and that's an actual picture of that vehicle. In order to take care of that problem, we replaced that fuel composition sensor. We put a filter on it while we were at it, and she never had any more trouble with that one. So be paying attention to that. Not all flex fuel vehicles have a flex fuel sensor. Some of them use a strategy that's tied to the oxygen sensors and stuff, so just keep that in mind. But a lot of your GM vehicles, some of the earlier Fords, they'd have really expensive fuel composition sensors on them that can go bad. All right, dripping injectors can cause hard starting as well. I saw a Thunderbird one time that would spend about 45 minutes when you started it hot, or not 45 minutes, 45 seconds when you started it hot. And I fooled with that thing for a while trying to figure it out. And finally, when I pulled the injectors out, I saw half of the injectors were washed clean. And so I realized that half of them were dripping. One injector can drip and cause the whole motor to start hard, though, because whenever that thing drips in a hot manifold, it will actually steam that manifold up with all kinds of gasoline steam First time you go to start it, all that steam goes in there and wets the dadgum plug, which is really annoying. And I've always talked about this, where you start it up and you let it run. You know, like sometimes it may not cause a hard start, but it may cause it to skip when it first started. And whenever I got one that's skipping when I first started and then it clears up, I crank it up, and while it's still skipping, I shut that sucker off. I pull all the plugs out of there, and when I pull all the plugs out of there, if one of them is wet, I see if it's water. If it's water, I'm going for a head gasket. If it's fuel, I'm going with a dripping injector. Pull the injector out. If that injector is clean and the rest of them are dirty on the tip, that means it's dripping. And I've fixed a bunch of them like that. All right, now that's something I've just told you about. Canister purge valve should be closed when it's not energized. If it's not, it'll cause hard or no start problems happen after fueling. I've seen this recently on 3 different vehicles. Hyundais can do it, GM vehicles can do it, Fords can do it. If that thing is open and you gas it up and all that vapor that's being pushed out of the tank goes straight through that canister purge valve, which should be closed when it's not energized, if it goes straight through that canister purge valve into the manifold and you start it up, or you try to start it up, all that vapor is going to condense when that air hits it, and it's going to go down there and wet the plugs, and you got to wait a little while before they dry out. If you hear somebody saying, well, when I gas up, it takes about 20 minutes before I can start my vehicle, the first place you're going to look at canister purge valve. If you can get that canister purge valve off, and it's not, and you don't have it juiced up with power or nothing, you should not be able to blow through it when it's not energized. And that's how I found the ones that I found. A woman called me about her daughter's 97 Altima, been in a local repair shop. She had a little bit of history of fender benders and stuff. Well, I called the shop, and the guy kind of gave up on it because, she was getting too much of a bill over there, and he still hadn't fixed it. He said, you can spray carburetor cleaner in there, and it'll fire right up. This is when it's cold, it would start hard, but it ran good the rest of the day. He said, spray carburetor cleaner, starts just fine. He said, I put another used engine controller on it, didn't fix it. And so I said, I just thought about this one. I got one like that. I don't like to swap a lot of parts. I do like to take readings and do diagnosis and all that if I can. I don't want to spend any money if I don't have to. But the important piece of data says he can add fuel and it would start normally. So TP sensors can fail in range and all that, but that wasn't it. We had good hot spark on that one. We didn't have any TP sensor issues. Spark timing was dead on it, even with the hard start. Scan tool, no codes, no discrepancies in the data stream. Fuel pressure normal, 40 off, 30 psi running with no leak down at shutdown. Battery voltage to the starter engage was 10.9 and holding steady. All right, this one here sat a little while. The intake air temp and engine cooler temperature systems were about 10 degrees apart. That's not that much. If they're too far apart, then you got an issue with one of them. But if they're not that far apart and it's warm in the shop or whatever, like you got a heater on, pay attention to that. Realize the 10-degree spread, the heaters were in the shop. So the IAT was a warmer one. Well, the IAT sensor had just been replaced. So unlike the OBD2 enhanced or OBD enhanced data stream, the OBD generic data stream won't show the substituted value like the 104 earlier. It'll show 40 below. That's your generic data stream. Every engine controller's got 2 rooms in it, a generic room and an enhanced room. You need to look in both of them. All the temp sensors should read the same after a thorough cold soak, though, unless it's got heaters on in the shop. I thought on it. I slept on it. I reflected on it. All right. If it doesn't know when it's in the start position, it won't know it's supposed to double pulse the injectors. And if you're spinning it over and it's just firing those things on the firing order, that 4-cylinder, that's not enough gas. All right. So here's the schematic of that one right there. All right. I want you to pay close attention to what's going on here. See that? That's the start position on that switch. It's going through a fuse to pin 20. We had checked pin 20 and it was dark as a tomb. There was nothing going on at any time, even when you turn it to start position. All right, there it is right there. I just zoomed in on it a little bit so you can see it. Looked in there and this fuse was gone, was missing. Somebody had pulled that fuse out of there because radio didn't work or something, put it in a different hole. And that was the whole problem she was having. All she needed was a doggone fuse. All right, so question 1. An engine suffers from a lack of power during acceleration. A vacuum test being performed at 2,500 RPM. The vacuum gauge drops slowly to 10 inches. Which of the following has caused that? It's going to be a clogged catalytic converter. If you're holding it up there and it goes down. I actually move my finger the wrong way. It ought to have 1822 when it's idling. When you give it the gas, it ought to go down and come right back up. And if you get gas and hold it, In other words, if you hold it, it ought to come right back up. But if you hold it, if it keeps going down, it can't breathe. It's got a sharp momentary hesitation only during acceleration. The most likely cause of this is going to be a faulty TP sensor. You can't just throw one of those on there. You need to verify that it drops out by doing a little sweep test, you know. How should spark be checked? Stick out your tongue is not a good way. I had my dad one time. My mom was out there with him, and he says, he was trying to get the lawnmower started, and he said, put your hand right there, and he had her put it on a spark plug wire, and he pulled the cord, and she goes, ah! He goes, well, it's got a spark anyway. That's a dirty trick. Don't do that to your girlfriend, or you may not have one anymore. All right. With your fingers? No. Have a girl from the office hold the coil wire? No, don't do that. Plastic pliers, a well-insulated screwdriver, or an adjustable spark tester. When the scan tool has been connected, what should you check first? I like to look at codes. Some people might want to look at PIDs. Some people might want to look. I like to look at codes. That's what I look at. The first thing I do. All right, the battery's strong. The engine spins normally. What should usually be checked first for a no start? What do you check first? You check spark. What you don't want to do is you don't want to check fuel pressure and spill a little gas on the engine and then check spark and set fire to it. Big time. Spark plug condition you'll check later. You're going to check what's quick and easy first. Engine coolant temperature sensors on today's vehicles are typically negative temperature coefficient thermistors. What that means is the hotter they get, the less resistance they have, which is exactly the opposite of what you would expect, right? All right, 93 octane gas burns slower than 87 octane. Because of that, and I didn't mention this, 93 octane gas can cause cold stumbles on an engine that's set up to run on 87 octane. There's TSBs from Chrysler and Ford about that I can show you. So if you put 93 octane where it doesn't supposed to be, you're liable to have some issues with that. 6-cylinder engine has a firing event every how far degrees? 120. What you're going to do is you're going to take the number of cylinders, divide it into 720. You're going to get how many degrees has to go by before you get a firing event. That's how that works. Okay, so 120, 6 times 120 is 720, see. 90 degrees would be a V8. 90 degrees would be a V8, and 180 degrees would be a 4-cylinder. Cylinder power balance test is being performed on a 4-cylinder engine. The number 3 cylinder is disabled and no drop in RPM is noticed. That means there should be a significant drop in RPM. That means that you're basically determined that cylinder is not firing. Now, if you pull the spark plug wire off and it runs better, that's a carbon track in your distributor cap usually, or that's a screwball situation. After performing a wet compression test on a single misfiring cylinder with low compression, the compression reading remained the same. Technician A says this is caused by incorrect valve timing. Technician B says this is caused by worn piston rings. That is going to be a neither, because if you wet test it and the compression stays the same, the compression loss is going to be due to a valve or some other place where it's getting out of there. Maybe a hole in the head of the piston, something like that. So anyway, that completes the video today, and I hope you had a good time with this. And once again, don't complain if you don't like it, because these things are free. I'm not charging you anything for them. And I'll talk to you guys next time.